Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the virtual Einstein Forum. My name is Martin Schad, and I'm going to guide you through this evening. And first of all, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Helen Paul, who's with us tonight. Hi, Helen.
Hello.
I would have much preferred meeting you in person, Helen, but things being as they are, I'm glad that we can at least get together via Zoom. Ladies and gentlemen, Helen studied at the beautiful Oxford University and later at the even more beautiful University of St Andrews. And from the far north, she went to the far south, and she is currently a lecturer in economics and economic history at Southampton University. As an economic historian, Helen is particularly interested in the early modern period. And she has published widely on things like the financial revolution, Atlantic history, the history of early joint stock companies, which will concern us today, I think, the role of the Navy in commerce, and on the triangular trade, including the slave trade. She is also a regular contributor to BBC Radio and to the Financial Times, the Scotsman, and many other newspapers. Most of the research interests that I've just mentioned come together in a singular event that will be her topic tonight, a stock market crash that took place exactly 300 years ago, the bursting of the infamous South Sea bubble in 1720. Before we start, please allow me one brief organizational remark. If members of the audience wish to contribute to the conversation, they are very welcome to do so by posting their questions or comments in the Q&A section of Zoom. You will find the appropriate button at the bottom of your screen. It is marked Q&A or F&A if you're using a German version. Please use this button and not the chat function. Helen will answer your queries towards the end of our discussion. Having said this, let us start. Helen, please take us to London in the early years of the 18th century. I will disappear now. The screen and the mic are all yours.
Thank you very much, Martin. Let me just put this up on my screen. So thank you for this lovely invitation. I'm very pleased to be here, if virtually. I wish I was here in person, as it were. But thank you to Martin for his kind invitation and for that lovely introductory remarks as well. I want to talk about the South Sea bubble, partly because I've spent the last 20 odd years working on it, but also it is the 300th anniversary of the bubble. If you'd like to email me at some point in the future, you can see my email there as well, or my information is on my university website as well. Now, the South Sea bubble is a very famous event, but it's not necessarily a very well understood one. So I want to talk about some of the research that's gone into unpacking the real history of the bubble and dealing with some of what Julian Hoppett has referred to as the myths of the South Sea bubble. A lot of people over the years have told me that they've heard of the bubble. They know a bit about it. They think it's something to do with fraud, gambling mania. They think that Isaac Newton lost a lot of money in it. It's some sort of stock market crash, but they don't know much more than that. It is as well the event that brought us the renewed vigor of Robert Walpole, who became effectively England's first prime minister for a very long time, partly because of his handling of the South Sea bubble. In essence, it is a financial market crash, so share prices go up across the summer of 1720 before falling precipitously as people leave the market. And that crash then leads to people demanding some sort of retribution. There's a big public outcry. There is a parliamentary inquiry, much scandal, and much is said. But actually, and somewhat oddly, very little of the workings of the bubble itself were made clear to the public, partly because they didn't really understand much about financial theory in 1720. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the underpinnings of the events. That includes what was happening in France, because the French economy was undergoing a series of important changes under the direction of a man called John Law, of whom you might have heard. The South Sea bubble gets its name from the South Sea Company, which holds an important slave trading contract called the Asiento. And I'll talk about that a bit. And there's also something that's a little bit harder to explain to a general audience, although I'm sure you'll be able to cope, but it's a debt for equity swap. Perfectly standard thing if you have a background in finance of any sort, but a mysterious and potentially fraudulent nonsense if you don't understand anything at all about finance. And here's one of the reasons why there's this discussion about fraud, gambling, various sorts of vacuum of information into which all kinds of theories can pour, because understanding of financial underpinnings can be quite dry and it can be quite complicated. And there's much more willingness to talk about the popular views of the bubble, which are much more entertaining and which I'll also go through as well. You'll see that they are entertaining, but they're frequently wrong. And they're about finding scapegoats, rounding up all the usual suspects and complaining about them, and then insisting that the government do something. As one of my friends says, something must be done. Here's something, let's do it. The government does something. It has a big inquiry, some of which becomes meaningful. The Bank of England steps in to sort out some of the problems on a financial basis. But an awful lot of it is simply political theatre, because actually, and somewhat oddly, the South Sea bubble is not that big a deal from an economic point of view. It's a famous bubble because it's the first, or in the international financial crisis, in a bubble year where the French market booms, the London market booms, and then to some extent, so does Amsterdam, and there are ripple effects in places like Hamburg. It's really the French bubble bursting that is truly damaging, because that is involved in far more of the financial architecture of the state. In reality, the South Sea bubble is much more localized, and it's far less important in economic terms. And this is one of the reasons why there are revisionist approaches by economic historians looking at more rational reasons to invest in the South Sea Company and other companies as well that were being of interest to shareholders within the 1720 boom period. We're used to stock market booms, say the dot-com bubble, for example. And we understand that these things are sometimes the market overheats and then the bubble bursts without anything like a gambling mania or a fraud being responsible. But in 1720, really, they didn't understand what was going on, but they insisted that somebody must be to blame and there must be some trickery. I would say that what they did uncover in the parliamentary inquiry was a bit of bribery from the company directors to various important people. But that is entirely standard for business practice at the time. And it doesn't really explain quite why the share price in other companies boomed and dropped again. So there must be something else going on. Here we have the famous Hogarth's South Sea bubble print. This is something that will pop up quite a lot. And if there hadn't been COVID this year and there'd been a lot of events on the South Sea, we would have seen this image all over the place, because it is the only genuinely original print made in England about the South Sea bubble. Oddly enough, it was actually the Dutch who were very good at creating prints. And so the English simply took Dutch prints, removed the Dutch lettering and replaced it with English, and then just resold it. They simply copied from the Dutch. This is the only one that is original and by William Hogarth himself. It is particularly famous, but it's something that people see and they don't really look at in any great detail. I'm going to show it to you a few times as we go through. You'll see in the middle here, you have this whirligig thing. On it, there is a Scotsman with his Scottish bonnet. There's an old woman, this looks like some sort of peasant woman, a clergyman, and some buxom lady. Who'll ride, it says at the top. Here, this monument to our right is actually the monument to the Great Fire of London, a truly destructive episode, repurposed now to be about the South Sea. And at the top, we have wolves climbing all over it. In fact, this is complete exaggeration. The South Sea bubble bursting was nowhere near as destructive as the Great Fire of London. And here we have various allegorical figures being broken on a wheel or whipped at a pillory or carved into pieces, and all sorts of hubbub going on. If you notice the lines in this drawing, you'll notice they don't go to a single vanishing point. And this is deliberate. It's to create a sense of disorder. The South Sea bubble became a symbol of disorder in the financial market, of scandal, and it simply was then a byword for these negative things about finance or stock markets, or even just human nature. And because it became a byword, the subtleties and the details seem to have been lost. It's actually this sort of image and also written texts about the bubble that have been looked at by literature people, literary historians, that dominate the public's understanding, because these are the entertaining and easily accessible versions of events. Here's a later one. It's in color. You can see it's a bit later in terms of the style, but it still goes for the same sort of idea that you have large numbers of people milling about in what is called Exchange Alley, which is where a lot of the share trading took place. We can see the words Change Alley written here. Or in a coffee house. Garraway's and Jonathan's were the most famous ones. And here we have the idea of all of humanity crowding in and buying shares in conditions of something like a casino, conditions where everything is very fast-paced, noisy, and confused. In reality, a lot of people took time to think about their share trading activities, and there seems to be a lot of evidence of a buy and hold strategy. In other words, people buy shares and hold on to them. And although there were some people who bought shares to sell them as speculation, an awful lot of people who had South Sea Company shares had got them for the long-term payments that were going to be made by the company, the kind of dividend payments. When the share price shot up to ridiculously high levels, some people sold out. One of those people was Thomas Guy, who has founded Thomas Guy's Hospital in London. And people like him don't get the same attention as the individuals who lose some money and complain about it. It is their losses and the kind of confusion of the alleyway that we hear about most. If you made money, you didn't have much incentive to talk about it, particularly, in case it got taken away from you and given back again. And this is yet another type of evidence that's used very, very extensively by literary critics and historians. Again, because it's entertaining, it's easily accessible. It's something that, again, creates this idea that people are crowding into an alleyway and wasting their time and money on something that is a falsehood, a false investment. There's no point in it at all. And there's an awful lot of focus on a mixing of different social groups and types of people within this space. Here at the top, we have Jews, Turks, and Christians. Hear my song. And they are in Jonathan's and Garraway, in other words, in the coffee houses. There's Scotsmen, Irish, Dutch, and Germans. again in Jonathan's and Garraway. And we have to remind ourselves as to what these things are really about. They're not just about people trying to make sense of the stock market, which is a fairly new thing for most people to understand, or a stock market bubble, which again is something that most people weren't very familiar with. There had been small stock market bubbles before, but nothing that was as famous. The South Sea bubble brought in money from people who really weren't used to investing, and it got the attention of the public in a way that previous bubbles had not. So whilst this is an attempt to somehow make sense of this, what a lot of literary critics and historians don't really stress is the fact that it's about the writer and the audience's dislike of social mixing. The stock market is open to anybody and everybody. Anyone can walk into Exchange Alley or into a coffee house. It is an opportunity for a large number of different people from different backgrounds to buy in. And certainly we find that all sorts of people bought into the London market. Some people bought into the French market, and you get places like, say, the canton of Bern in Switzerland sending money across to London. With a particularly nationalist response, a response that's about the importance of Christian men of a certain social standing to be in charge, they felt threatened by the potential for the stock market to undermine the social structure as it was. And that has to be borne in mind when we're looking at these sorts of pieces of evidence which critique the stock market. They often are taken just at face value. There is a long-standing tradition here of complaining about women in particular being in the stock market. These cards are from a set of playing cards, which are clearly made for a male audience, quite a wealthy male audience. They critique various types of people. These ones, although they're not quite easy to see because they're not very well drawn, are women who are meeting together to talk about their share trading activities. The idea is about women's consumption in terms of their interest in buying coaches or country houses, and their interest in getting money at all costs. Getting the marriage market keeps coming up, and also the idea of women's sexual propriety, that somehow if you let them make money in the stock market, who knows what they're going to do next. So you see women sitting around gossiping in a shop and the brokers coming in to them. A number of the other cards are about women throwing away a good husband or a good potential husband simply to get somebody else with money, or old women with money getting themselves a young man. And this consideration keeps coming up in all discussions of women's investment patterns. Going back to this Hogarth print, if we look here on the left, I've blown this up a little bit. We have here the lady I pointed out before, who is touching the face of a clergyman. She's obviously some sort of, shall we say, woman of loose morals. And these people, and again, it's slightly hard to read this, so I'll read it for you. This is raffling for husbands with lottery fortunes in here, and a whole load of women going in. The notion, the lottery was not just a gambling event, it was also a way of investing money in government debt, something similar to a British premium bond. And these women are going into this house to try and get better husbands who have a bit of money. At the top of this building, tucked away as a small detail, are cuckold's horns. This is a symbol of a man who has been, whose wife has cheated on him. The idea being that women's sexual impropriety is connected in to their agency through the stock market. And that's the real reason why any woman would be interested in getting involved in shares. If we look at what economic historians, social historians, and legal historians have found out. Actually, share trading and control of your own money is made perhaps a little bit easier through the stock market for some women. There's a couple of French legal terms, or legal French terms rather, that I'd like to mention. Now, legal French is used in England, and it's a sort of bastardized French. Femme sole and femme couverte look like badly spelled words in French. A femme sole is a woman who's unmarried for some reason. She could be never married spinster or a widow. She's able to be a legal person in her own right. So she can sue people and be sued by them. She can own her own property. A femme couverte is a married woman. Her legal identity disappears on marriage and reappears when her husband dies, which might sound quite strange. But it means she can't sue anyone directly. She has to get her husband to do it. And under a very convoluted series of legal ins and outs, essentially a lot of her property will transfer directly to her husband on marriage, although some of it will be kept for her widowhood, and some of it she could keep back with various kinds of trust fund arrangements called separate estates. If you're interested in these more knotty problems of women's investment, Amy Erickson and Amy Freud have both written excellent books on the subject. Amy Erickson's has discussed how widely these separate estate contracts were used so that married women could control some of their money. And Amy Freud has looked at women's investment. She's highlighted how, whilst the popular culture criticized women for wanting to get in the stock market in order to get men or throw away their husbands, actually what most of them seem to want to do is just to have a better standard of living, to make sure that they had food on the table, and that they may have been interested in stock market investments because they were relatively easy to control. Absolutely everything else, owning land, making personal loans, even putting your money in a bank account, was an awful lot of hassle. Bank accounts didn't pay you any interest. And so actually, weirdly, the shares become attractive to women. And you can also, if you wanted to, hide your investments from your husband. Although a number of powerful women who were technically under their husband's control through this law of femme couverte were actually in practice the people in the family who did all the share trading and financial dealings. This is to highlight the fact that just because the law says something doesn't mean that that's how it's enacted in practice. So we have some very important people like Sarah Churchill, who was a duchess, who theoretically is under her husband's control, but is actually a big investor and is trusted by her husband to do that investment. Looking at women's investments, we can't look at the South Sea Company books themselves because they seem to have been destroyed in a fit of clearing out. Somebody gets rid of them about 100 years after the South Sea bubble, just to make some space in an archive somewhere. But the Bank of England ledgers are there and have been used by Larry Neal and Anne Carlos. And they found that there were quite a number of women who were shareholders of the Bank of England, and even a female broker who acted on behalf of other people. So women's involvement in the stock market was used by popular culture, which was usually under the control of men, to talk about women being irrational and making the stock market irrational, and that they shouldn't be in the stock market at all. It was bad for them and bad for society and bad for everything else. Whereas when you actually look at what women did in practice, it was a lot more, as we might expect. A lot of them were thinking through their investments pretty clearly. And they weren't necessarily caught up in the bubble. We have got elements of people who are actually living at a distance from London. They're not in Exchange Alley. They're not becoming whipped up into a frenzy because they're in this small alleyway We have here power of attorney documents where somebody called Eliza Bard, for example, is sending her instructions to somebody else to act on her behalf. She lives in Bedford, which is it's not easy to get to London. You can't go there instantly. So she needs somebody to act on her behalf. And she has this specially printed document to do so. This is the South Sea Company's very complicated crest at the top here. And this is printed out so that you can get someone to pick up dividends for you or buy and sell shares for you from the company itself. You can instruct people as to what to do. And this delayed response actually makes it clearer that a lot of people are not simply gambling in the stock market in the alley, in this hubbub, but they're living further away and they're having to think things through before they send instructions that take some time to arrive. And then somebody then has to go and enact that instruction. Another group of people that are going to get criticized in the stock market is anyone who's deemed to be an outsider. That could be a foreigner or somebody who comes from a religious group that's deemed to be not the Church of England. And that's quite a large number of people, as you can imagine. This card on the left is highly anti-Semitic. You can see that there's a Jewish broker being thrown into a horse pond with various statements being made around the edges about him. The association with Jewish people in finance had already been long established at this point. And again, you get a kind of vicious circle that Jewish people and others, like Italians or other sorts of foreigner group, if you like, they have connections in different stock markets. So that's part of the reason that they can be international stock market traders. But they're also blocked out of a lot of economic activities elsewhere. So they're pushed into this particular role and then they're criticized for it. The association with finance and the devil, we can see on the right here. There was this difficulty, especially in Christian theology, of understanding what it is that financiers did, because what they did was as part of the service sector. And the service sector was very difficult for early economic thinking to really assess. And that's because early economic thinking tended to be religious thinking. If you were not making something as a physical object, but transporting it or marketing it or lending money, what were you actually doing? We would see this service sector as important, but even today, you'll notice that a lot of politicians and members of the public are obsessed with manufacturing instead of the service sector, or certain sorts of business rather than the arts sector or cultural industries, no matter how much money those industries might make. There seems to be as well with finance, this notion that something is a trick, and finance phobia is very easy sell. It's very easy to continually insist that financiers are doing something wrong. In the absence of any real information, this kind of devil figure of an evil financier tends to come to the core. And here, this is again part of that very complicated Hogarth print. Here at the bottom, we have two Catholic clergy playing a game of pitch and toss, which is a gambling game, with a Jewish character. Catholics, like Jews, being considered as some sort of threat to the system of the true Englishman. I should probably say at this point that I don't have any English ancestry. So I'm just saying that this is part of a consideration of what it is to be truly English. And a lot of people like the Welsh, the Scots, the Irish as well were deemed as outsiders because they were. And their involvement in potentially doing well in the stock market, along with women and servants, who were another category that people, the elite, wanted to keep in their place. The notion that these people would do well out of this rising share price is very destabilizing. it explains why there's so much horror about the rise in prices. What else is going on is something, as I said, that was a bit more dry and convoluted, called a debt for equity swap. Essentially, there's been a lot of war going on. It's very expensive. One war, the War of the Spanish Succession, has come to an end, and the Spanish crown gives Queen Anne, Queen of England, the right to ship slaves, enslaved Africans from the coast of Africa to the Spanish colonies. Spain at this point is teetering between two different royal families, the Habsburgs and the Bourbons. That's what that war was actually about. And there's a possibility that Spain might lose its colonies as it's overextended its empire. So anyone who gets this slave trade contract could potentially have the first step into grabbing a former Spanish colony from the Spanish. The Baltic area is still fighting the Great Northern War, which involves all sorts of people fighting Sweden, but that war is becoming clear that it's winding down. And because of that, there's going to be a move perhaps to dealing with assets that have been hidden under the bed, or that somebody is willing now to reinvest in trade, because the trading routes are opening up. They have been moving from a wartime economy to a peacetime one. The government has had problems keeping payments up for all its war debts, including to its Navy contractors. And these are people who are threatening to stop actually supplying the Navy, which would be disastrous. The government, desperately enough, generates a new company, the South Sea Company, and generates some shares, hands those shares to the Navy contractors in exchange for some of their debts. The idea being that in the future, the company will be able to get this slave trade off the ground, and that will be part of the reason why the company will be profitable. But it's also the case that the government is acting as it still is having to pay money off its debts. And the company, the South Sea Company, is going to be a kind of middleman. Government pays a fee to the company pays dividends to its shareholders. Why is this necessary? And this is the issue about why would you swap government debt for company shares? A lot of people think of British government debt as being really very solid, gilt-edged, but they're thinking of modern government debt. If you look at the government debt of the 1720 period and before, the government is not keeping up its payments and is issuing, for various political reasons, short-term, badly created financial instruments. It's got umpteen of those of different sorts. It's a very bureaucratic nightmare. And not only is it not keeping up payments on all of this, it's also very difficult under the legal system of the time for anyone holding one of these government debt instruments to sell it on to anyone else. So there's a problem with getting ready cash. If you swap your, if you like, old-fashioned government debt instrument for a brand new company share, then it's more liquid. You can sell it off whenever you want. So there is, as Larry Neal has said, a liquidity premium. You're also putting together all of your various ordinary members of the public as creditors. They're all gathering their monies, their various IOUs, and handing them to a company that acts on their behalf. It's much more difficult for the government to say no to a company that it needs to keep paying. So actually this modernizes essentially a lot of the government debt. And it isn't something that's just appeared out of thin air. It is, in fact, a debt for equity swap of this kind that explains the founding of the Bank of England a few years earlier. The bank takes on a lot of these old-fashioned IOUs and gives people shares in exchange. The government pays its debt dues to the bank instead of paying all these different people all sorts of things. And the whole thing becomes an open-ended long-lasting perpetual debt rather than a more expensive short-term debt system. Now, if that sounds very dry and dull, I apologize, but that's why, part of the reason why the South Sea Company is considered to be a good, solid investment by a lot of people. They just know they're going to get a fee from the government no matter what happens with the company's trading arm. And that's exactly what happens when the company eventually gives up its share slave trading sometime after the bubble. It also tries catching whales, has a whaling business, and gives that up as well. And then it carries on for about 100 years, just basically handling government debt. It is therefore quite a reasonable thing if all you want to do is to be a rentier and just have this very low risk, steady, reasonable government debt backed instrument that you're going to be able to sell on whenever you want. This is the thing that I find very difficult to explain to people who are insistent that there is some sort of gambling mania or fraud, because the minute they hear debt for equity swap, they think it's some sort of magic trick. And that, again, is part of the reason why it's so difficult for the general public at the time of the bubble to understand it as well, because they don't even have all these terms like debt for equity swap, and they certainly don't have a body of financial theory or any sort of financial training. If you're going to be a share trader, stockbroker, you really learn by doing an awful lot of the time. There's lots of how-to information, how to sell a share, but there's not much about this kind of what are financial markets, how do they work, what we might call academic finance 101. There's nothing like that. And for a long time, we were told quite authoritatively that the company didn't have a slave trade. This goes into this gambling mania argument where everyone goes mad and gambles. The notion that a company could possibly hoodwink large numbers of people, that it was involved in a slave trade, which it wasn't actually bothering to do. This is ludicrous, considering that it was dealing with ships that were going from the River Thames. At this time period, it's easy to monitor that because you can just walk down to the river and look at the ships. They're not tucked away in some dockyard that you can't see behind a high wall, or tucked away far away from the main part of London. In fact, the docks that these people are using are going to be in the heart of London, the area that you'd now think of as around the Embankment, right into probably the bit that you're familiar with as a tourist. That's where you're going to get the ships. And the company works with the Royal African Company, which is a well-established slave trading company that has forts on the African coast and a lot of experience. The Royal African Company hasn't been doing so well, it must be said, but it's still backed up by the Royal Navy, giving them these ships convoying arrangements. Now, this is some old data of mine that comes from my book on the South Sea. What I would say is that this is these are slaves that come across on South Sea Company voyages as per the slavevoyages.org database. However, the company also bought people in the Caribbean and shipped them to the Spanish colonies. And there are probably some mistakes in the database as well, because they have some hired ships that they hire from people and they send over slaves that way. Realistically, one of the things that's caused a few problems is that there's a stoppage, there's a dispute with Spain in about 1718, 1719. And some people have said, well, why would you be interested in South Sea Company shares if the trade stops briefly? This is why there's a time lag. There's a little bit of when there's a dispute with Spain, there are all sorts of problems of the Spanish just blocking people from going about their business. But the reality is that people buy shares to be forward-looking. They know that the slave trade will eventually reappear again, because really the South American colonies need African slaves, such as the mortality rate, that although they've got local people, local indigenous Americans as slaves as well, they're still needing to bring in new people. And the Spanish themselves don't have any presence on the African coast. They don't have any background in the slave trade as slave shippers. The British are actually the best at this point, and that's why they've got the contract. So essentially, one of the problems with the slave trade being removed from the story in order to make it sound more appealing to a popular audience is that it ignores the huge amounts of suffering of all of these people that are only unnamed and are only known about in terms of just raw data of how many of them were put on various ships. So you can see these two different graphs. It gives you a sense of, you see, these are the people who are being brought into Spanish America by the South Sea Company. So that includes people being brought in from Caribbean. We've had an awful lot about the slave trade recently, and it bears saying that the South Sea Company really was deeply involved in the slave trade, and for some time after the bubble as well. It carries on and on and on, and eventually that peters out, partly for various political reasons that I won't go into, but there was no lack of interest in it, which is what had been argued in the past, that the company directors were simply not interested and that they never involved themselves in it at all, which doesn't make any sense and makes it sound as if people in the 18th century must have been completely stupid. They weren't. They may have been over-enthusiastic in some cases about buying into these shares, and some people may have lost money, but it wasn't the case that you can completely scam people with a trade like this one. There are various reasons why you might be interested in this bubble, why this bubble might occur without having a gambling mania. I've mentioned the end of 2 wars and the potential to have a slave colony. Also, the investment landscape at the time was fairly limited. If you wanted something that was like a share, there wasn't much else other than buying shares. Everything else was a lot more difficult to deal with. Even bank accounts were much more convoluted than they are today. So you didn't have quite so many options if you just wanted to buy and hold shares. And you could come into the market with very small amounts of money. So servants could come in as well. The French had overhauled their economy under John Law, and it had been really a complete disaster in the end. This is the Mississippi bubble, about which we could have a whole book in and of itself. But basically, Law sees the stock market go up in value, and then it drops down considerably, partly because of his actions of being too quick to try and implement extreme financial changes, having an official paper currency when people weren't really ready for it. Things like this. And a lot of money came out of France and headed to London. That pushed up the prices there. That's called a contagion effect. And also you get people, we know now from behavioral finance, that people are influenced by each other. So of course you get herding into a certain share. People become over enthusiastic. It doesn't mean they've gone gambling mad. It means they may be influenced by other people around them and become over enthusiastic. And some may have rationally realized that there was a bubble going on and thought they would buy in the short term and then sell out. And that again tends to push up the price a bit in the short run. None of these things require anything mysterious to be going on. What did happen is that we have a very new royal family, the Hanoverians from Germany. So they had to be protected. 1 or 2 of them had been really implicated in the bribery scandal. The King's mistress, King George I's mistress, had been taking backhanders from the South Sea Company. And this was all covered up by the man who stepped in to sort it out politically, Robert Walpole. It was clear that he was up to something, and he was criticised for his screen. He did allow the South Sea Company cashier, Robert Knight, to escape, made a big fuss about trying to get him back, but then secretly trying to tell people to let him go again. This is Robert Knight here, standing in the Devil's Row barge. I've mentioned that there's a lack of financial theory, and certainly this was a first international crisis of its sort, which made the lack of financial theory even more important. People were told that some of the contracts made during the bubble would be revisited. And in fact, some of them were. This is to do with the debt for equity swap issues, where holders of government debt were allowed to swap them for shares. The last tranche of that were altered. But there was certainly not the case that large numbers of people who'd lost money through buying in good faith from somebody who sold in good faith, they didn't get their money back. However, there was this possibility that they thought they would get it back. Hence, you get far more people talking about their losses and fewer people talking about their gains. I've mentioned this interest in scapegoating various types of people that plays into wider issues around the society of the day. It's a great opportunity to attack the usual suspects. And also, even if somebody doesn't lose a great deal, they seem to be very obsessed with their losses. This is something, again, that psychologists and economists have actually found out in modern day studies, that people make a big fuss about quite small losses. So you get a lot of people who've maybe lost a bit of money and become really obsessed with it, but they're not actually completely ruined. The stories of totally being ruined are usually exaggerated. And there's this entire industry, which I highlighted at the beginning, which makes money out of scandal. And if financial scandal is scandal, then they make money out of that as well. The prints, plays, poems, various other things are often older ideas that are just refashioned to deal with this latest craze. Hopefully, you can see that there's a disjoint between the way the bubble was experienced by people at the time and what was really going on. And that disjoint has continued on through the years as various myths have grown up around the company. We've been told authoritatively that it didn't have any slaves. We've been told that it was simply a fraud. There was nothing at all going on that made any sense. And of course, the debt for equity swap particularly has caused trouble for popular historians to understand. Many of them would much rather go about talking up the scandal side of things than anything else. But economic historians have looked at the economy after 1720, and they haven't found much evidence of some sort of big economic shock. So perhaps the bubble has been misunderstood as being far more damaging than it actually was. So thank you very much indeed. I think that probably 45 minutes on that subject is more than enough. And I look forward to hearing your questions and also chatting to Martin about it as well. I'll just stop sharing my screen. There we are.
Thank you very much, Helen. It was a fascinating and a rich talk, combining economic history, social history, and even popular culture. And that is what makes it stand out, I guess, when it comes to talking about a stock market crisis that is often referred to as an early example of later incidences of the same sort. I would like to raise 3 points and underline what you have been saying and raise a few questions about it before we get to the questions from the audience. The first point is about the financial underpinnings of the scheme itself. And I think it's important and worth underlining your point that debt for equity swaps are not inherently flawed or necessarily fraudulent. In fact, they offer benefits for all three parties involved, as you pointed out. For the individual debt holder turning shareholder, it would be liquidity in the first instance, and perhaps reduced risk of government default, and perhaps also the possibility of higher returns if the Spanish Empire collapses. For the government, it does mean an enormous reduction in bureaucratic expense, doesn't it? They only have to deal with one creditor rather than hundreds or thousands of small creditors. And even for the company, it's not a silly thing to do. It's actually quite worthwhile. And that refers to the privilege they're being granted by a royal charter. In this case, conducting the trade, in particular slave trade, with the South American colonies of Spain. And perhaps also increased flexibility for the government because it was converting irredeemable annuities to redeemable debt. It could pay it back. And for the company, again, it's the fee that's being paid by government annually. So there are benefits all round. And it's worth remembering that the South Sea Company was not the only and not even the first company that was dealing in that way. Not only the Bank of England, which you mentioned, but the East India Company held national debt to a great extent. And here it worked. There was no bubble. And that's perhaps the leading me to a question. Was it because the respective privileges granted to, say, the Bank of England issuing banknotes and offering banking services, or the East India Company, the trading privilege in the Indian Ocean, they were rather safe bets because you knew the volume of the East India trade and you knew how much you can make from offering banking services. But may I just put it to you that the real flaw of the South Sea Company was that the privilege it was granted, the expected value of the privilege it was granted, was so difficult to ascertain that it could end up in disaster if there was another war and trade routes were blocked, or it could be the big prize, the lottery win of a new colony in South America. So the width of what could happen was so difficult to ascertain that it lent itself to speculation rather more than other joint stock companies with a royal charter offered.
Yeah, it's hard to know now because the East India Company, again, would have been affected by the same sort of trade route, war type things. And we know that the East India Company effectively goes on to rule India. But that didn't necessarily going to happen because it had problems as well. The Bank of England isn't what it is now. It wasn't a national bank. It was just a private bank. And again, it was given a charter that was not open-ended. It was going to be told you can work as a bank for a certain period of time. So again, for a lot of these sorts of really successful institutions, their success was not obvious at the time. And the South Sea Company as well has all these problems potentially, but it also has connections to the source of gold and silver, which is the Spanish Empire. So Potosi, the mines of Potosi are famous. And yes, the East India Company has spices, and we think in terms of trading goods being important. They thought in terms of gold and silver. So if you could get that gold and silver, That was hugely important. And also the slave trade as well was understood to be something that was going to be very, very lucrative. Now, as it happens, the South Sea Company and the Royal African Company eventually lose their control, but then the British go on to be the great slave traders in other ways. Again, that wouldn't be, you're substituting one lot of slavers with another, rather than, and the Spanish Empire, somewhat oddly, managed to do very well for itself, maybe because it was now under a different king. The Bourbon kings had taken over from the Habsburgs. Maybe the Habsburgs had run out of steam to some degree. But yeah, none of that was at all clear to people at the time. And you could buy shares in all of these companies and have a diversified portfolio.
Just to follow on this one, I think it's worthwhile, again, just to be clear about one thing: the South Sea Company did not fold as a result of the bubble bursting. It continued operations, and you showed that with your graphs. And it did trade in slaves, and it also took part in Arctic whaling, as you mentioned. But aside from these activities, it also continued to manage part of the national debt. If I'm correctly informed, well into the 19th century. So, two questions relating to that. Did the government meet its obligations in full at the end? And if so, would it not be reasonable to conclude that the South Sea Company was very successful? Because it actually served the purpose for which it was created. Never mind the bubble bursting, never mind all these individual shareholders who lost money. It worked.
It did work. All that government debt was transferred away into the shares. So everybody who held all these old-fashioned IOUs, and you mentioned the irredeemable debt a little bit earlier, a lot of things for various reasons to do with political control, the governments were not allowed to contract very long-term debt for quite some time because other politicians didn't like the idea of not being able to control the government. So this move to an open-ended perpetual debt was a major step forward, with the different companies involved that you've mentioned doing this. The government or the taxpayer has only got rid of that South Sea Company tranche of debt in the 21st century, I think. I can remember a few years ago it was paid off. Yeah, the company carried on into the mid-19th century, but then was wound up, and its tranche of debt that it was still holding got transferred back into government hands, as it were, but it was still being paid off. The government was managing it itself, and it was carrying on and on and on. And fairly recently, there was a press release about it, or some sort of political statement.
Last penny has been paid.
Last one has been paid. Exactly. But they've only just paid off the debts they owe to the slave owners' compensation payments in the Caribbean, which again shows how long these things go on for. But again shows that short-term debt, if you can make it open-ended, you can carry on, you can bear huge amounts of payments. So I think you're right that overall the company and the government come out the other side of all of this.
Yeah. Let me come to a second point, one which is most fascinating to me, and that's what you said about how the South Sea bubble over time became a symbol for folly and fraud, with prints, books, satires, plays. You've shown us some of those, and they were very good. And I love them because this is where economic, social, and cultural history come together. And as far as I can see, for the immediate aftermath of the crash, we can distinguish three rather different kinds of reactions. First, and perhaps most vocal, would be those who had lost heavily in the crash themselves and who focused on, let's say, the fraud aspect of the episode. Then there were those, perhaps an overlapping group, who attributed the bursting of the bubble to the decisions of investors who were either inexperienced or evil. This is classic scapegoating, as you said. It's the silly and the sinister. It's the women and the Jews. And thirdly, there were those who decried the immorality of the whole enterprise itself, the blind greed and the irresponsibility of gambling, of luxury, of any indulgences of that sort. Let me ask a few questions about these three reactions. With regard to the first, I think you have convincingly argued that this should be seen as an exaggeration, and it's by way of a bias in the sources. It's those who lost who complain the most, and those who gained rather not talk about it. But there was some fraud. And that would be my question. There was some fraud, wasn't there? How did it work? Okay, can I do would you like to answer this separately?
Yeah, it might be, because otherwise people get a bit confused.
Okay.
Yeah, there's bribery, which we might consider to be fraud, or we could consider that to be part of the standard way of doing things at the time. And which is difficult, because without the law and the various discussions about what is and what is not ethical, we don't really know, because you have potentially what might well be seen as insider trading is not considered technically illegal at this point. The company does something very weird. It issues loan cash to people who own shares in an effort to try and make its shares more attractive. And this is actually stupid. It's not really fraud, but it's not very clever. And as well, the bribery side of it, that's where the scandal is, because you've been caught. Something's gone wrong and now you've been caught. Whereas if nothing had gone wrong, it was seen probably as part of the normal way of doing business at the time. But in terms of some sort of trick, like we're going to do slave trading, but we haven't, that isn't present. It isn't. And the debt for equity swap, as you said, isn't in and of itself a fraudulent or strange thing to do.
Yeah. As to the second reaction, the misogyny and the anti-Semitism, which you identified, could you perhaps say a little more about why women and Jews were immediately singled out? Were they just the easiest of targets, or was that part of a wider and perhaps ongoing social or political conflict that was prevalent at the time?
Yeah, Jewish people and Italians, the various people who'd been, or anybody who was in the international trading world, were identified with international finance and international trade, because they were the ones who had links to somebody in Amsterdam, because that was their cousin in Amsterdam. So there were Jewish families, usually Sephardim, who were really physically manifested this idea of the international Jewish financier. But most Jewish people in England, and there weren't that many of them, were not involved in finance, were very poor. So they were simply being castigated because of ideas about Jewish people and usury that had been, there's a long tradition of anti-Semitism in England that comes up again, but also anti-Catholicism and anti-this and that and somebody else. Jewish people in particular always seem to be targeted with regard to financial scandals, even today. So you've got this long-standing, centuries and centuries of it. As for women, it's a culture run by men. So there's this very strange view of women. They're necessary in a way that Jewish people were seen as unnecessary or outsider. You need to have wives and daughters and female servants and people like that. but they shouldn't get power, and they shouldn't be behaving in ways that are outside of your control. They're not fit to decide what to do. They have to be protected. So you get this very confused view of, are women dangerous to themselves, dangerous to other people, dangerous to the stock market? Is the stock market damaging them? It becomes this very weird state of affairs. And again, you could say that again is centuries and centuries of the way things had always been done. And in the South Sea bubble is just another opportunity for all these ideas to come out.
All right, let's turn to the third group I was mentioning, those who decried the immorality of the stock market itself as a place where blind greed and irresponsibility rule. I would like to invite you to say a few more words about the wider and the longer term implications of the South Sea bubble on both moral philosophy and economic thought. And perhaps, if I may suggest, reference to George Berkeley in the first instance and Bernard Mandeville in the second.
Well, I wonder how much, well, with Mandeville, I don't know, because as he was from Rotterdam, the Dutch are really the people, or was it, he was from the Netherlands somewhere, so he was the Dutch, have that background in finance, but his view about how people who are virtuous are going to end up with nothing, really, the bees that have nothing. I'm not quite sure where that comes from in terms of his own thinking. And I don't really know how much the South Sea Company in the bubble itself, is actually connected into that. It's certainly...
the fable of the bees predates the South Sea bubble, of course, but the 1923 edition is hugely successful because of the South Sea bubble. As 1723.
But yeah, I don't know whether this is just more, whether that's really economic thought or more a kind of more of the popular response again, because Mandeville's thinking gets kind of repackaged by Adam Smith, and there's not a lot of mention of it there. I suppose it's just another publishing opportunity. The South Sea bubble seems to be this opportunity to spew. Publishers do well out of it with all sorts of things, but I don't necessarily know how important it is in terms of the kind of people who think about things in terms of economic thinking. They seem to be involved with debates about things like recoinage, because coins and recoinage seem to be, if you like, a real issue, a real political issue, a real conundrum. Whereas what's gone on in the market involving people losing money, I think is just written off as a kind of folly. It's oddly not really, as I was saying, it's not really compacted into much to do with financial theorizing or early economic thought. And it's a bit difficult before Adam Smith. You can see these various threads coming through, but they're not really about stock markets. They're really about agriculture or coinage or something of that sort, or international trade, rather than finance, which is a slightly different thing.
Right. One final point for me before I read out a question. I only have one. I've just seen. The story you told us is a cautionary tale. It says that we should not confuse the later symbolic meaning of the bubble with the historical magnitude of the event itself. That's how far as I've read it. By implication, that also means that you seem to be warning that a comparison of the South Sea bubble with more recent financial crises may well be misleading. But I cannot resist. I mean, you probably have anticipated this. I cannot resist. And this is because I think that the question of folly or gambling mania may deserve an answer that takes the bubble not as an event, but as a process. What I mean is this: while there may be very good reasons for investors to want to swap their annuities for shares early on, once you get to the later or to the latest phase of the crisis, we're talking indeed about silly money, very silly money. If you were a latecomer to the market and you start buying shares at a price which is already more than 10 times the price asked at flotation, and if you actually borrow money to buy these shares, then alarm bells should have been ringing. Ringing out loud. And as to the historical comparison, I do not hereby want to refer to the financial crises of the first 2 decades of this century. They seem, to me, at least in part, be caused by structural defects in the market or the banking sector. But rather, I'd like to point to the dot-com bubble you mentioned of the 1990s. Again, folly and gambling mania there? What do you think, Helen?
I think some of it, when you look at some of the dot-com companies, they don't have a strong foundation, because you're looking at people putting money into anything with a .com on it and having access, easy access. It's a bit like going into a coffee house. You can now easily access the stock market. Well, there was a period in the middle where you would have to go maybe through a broker and get some advice, and it would be more difficult. But the reality is that some of those .com companies are with us today. The ones that had a sound footing did make money. And if you'd bought in at the right time to the right company, you would have made a lot of money. There will be a minority of people, and it doesn't have to be a big number, who will put money, as you say, in silly money. And there's also people who follow the silly money in the short run. They know that company X is not going to work because it's not very integrated with the fact that if you sell stuff online, you actually have to send it by road, and someone has to physically take it to someone's house, which wasn't really understood in the dot-com bubble. So it's, well, we do this and we do that. Yeah, but somebody has to physically go along the road and do that, whatever it is, deliver it. If you understand that that's not going to work, but you understand that other people are interested in it, you buy into it and sell it to them. Now, why there are some people, not everybody, but some people who are willing to do this is a different kind of psychological question that is a bit outside the realm of economists' thinking, and there's more to do with perhaps psychologists. Why would you fall for that? And certainly with the South Sea, there will be some small number of people who bought right at the top of the market and then sold out right at the bottom of the market. Robert Walpole himself very nearly bought a very high price shares and was stopped from doing so by his sidekick Jacob. And Jacob is actually the person who did a lot of the thinking about how to solve the financial problems created by the bubble, how to hand over some of the company's debt to the Bank of England, and how to do this and how to do that. So Walpole was thinking, probably other people have made money, so I have to get in now. And this notion of I must get this bargain. Why people do that, it doesn't mean that everyone's doing it. It just means you have some doing it. And they pop up, as you say, in the dot-com bubble just as well.
Thank you very much, Helen. I've got a question from Misha Gabovich. I'll read it out to you. Your point that the stock market acted as a powerful leveler of social difference is fascinating. You mentioned that servants could enter the market with only small sums to invest. Is this something that was built into the stock market from the beginning, or were there formal or informal, estate-based restrictions that first had to be overcome, similarly to how women sometimes had to act through their husbands?
No, it was very much an informal state of affairs. You don't have a lot of the legal architecture to stop you from doing things. You don't have a physical space like a stock market building that you can't physically get into. You don't have to go through a broker. Even with the London stock market being formally established in the 1801, the building was put up with a whole load of brokers following a set of rules. You didn't have to deal with those brokers if you didn't want to. You could have a broker outside the exchange. And you could, in 1720, you could go into the various places, the coffee houses, the Bank of England Hall, South Sea Company House yourself, or you could get someone to do it for you who didn't have to be a broker. They could be your friend, whatever. Now, what brought servants in and other people as well on a low income is lotteries. The government raised a lot of money through lottery tickets, which it allowed to be split into smaller tickets. So you could buy a part share in a lottery ticket, which wouldn't just be about the lottery ticket winning or losing. It would be sometimes some sort of a much more of a return on investment than that there would be some that would be maybe that you would get a certain amount, or you get that lottery ticket put back into the lottery each time, or something. So it wasn't just a kind of gamble. There was often a lot more. It was often quite similar to the way that dividends would pay out. And so this idea of splitting down a financial instrument into smaller portions appears again with the South Sea Company and the Mississippi Company in France, where you bought a share, but you could pay by installments. So you didn't have to pay it all at once. And that's built in because they're desperate for funds. And frankly, by the time they're selling to the general public, they've already tried everything else. And now they really want everybody's money. And that's part of the reason for this.
Thank you very much, Helen. This has been, there's another question. Hang on. A question from Susan Nyman. And it's a follow-on to Misha's questions, which has also struck me, Susan. Is it possible to discern from the criticisms how much of them were fueled by class anxiety? This was suddenly a way for everyone to get rich.
Mm. The bubble cards that I showed you, which you can look for yourself at on the Harvard University Baker Library website, has a whole load of these things that you're able to look at. They have a couple of them that are actually positive about share trading. And one of them has an older man who is a landowner, depicts him taking his servants' wages without telling them and investing it in the stock market and then selling out and giving them the proceeds. And they're looking delighted. And this is seen by the people who presumably had created these cards as a perfectly reasonable thing to do, that this man should act almost as your father figure. You're an adult, but you're a servant, so you're under his control. Naturally, he should be able to invest for you with your money without telling you. And that's all fine. Now, this is something that, frankly, is then at odds with other cards that are about people who are mocked for coming from a lower social background. There's an awful lot about servants who are an essential force in the labor market. And obviously, if they make money, they stop being servants. So quite a lot of this at the top level is written by people who have servants who are not actually themselves poor or servants. Yes, and that's why we can kind of see sometimes their anxieties coming through, because this is a whole society based on the notion that a lot of people are poor and they do all the work that you at the top don't want to do. and they have no mechanism really of really moving out of the trade that they were born into. But the stock market potentially opens this up, so you get people being mocked in different not just these bubble cards but elsewhere. People who've come up from nothing and got a coach, because having a coach seemed to be a really aggravating factor. That I don't know how many people actually went and bought coaches with their South Sea Company money, but this seemed to be the idea that you're going to have this real status symbol of buying a coach or buying other things. So yes, a lot of it is about class anxiety.
What surprises me, or even amuses me a little bit, is that the criticism of the South Sea bubble gambling mania is actually printed on cards, on card games.
Yes.
That's a lovely thing, lovely irony. Helen, thank you very much for this evening. It was wonderful listening to you and discussing with you, and I hope you enjoyed it too, and our audience has enjoyed themselves too. We've learned a lot, and I'd like to thank you very much. And can I just say that the background to your video is wonderful, with the possible exception of your head blocking our view to the British Isles. So we see you as you're from Southampton. Now, briefly we did. Thank you very much again, and till soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you for everybody listening as well.